Good morning, Codebaker 1. We are learning about BLoC by building some fun Flutter games with Flame. At the top of our Flutter application in main.dart, we have a way to provide the BLoC state management system to both the Flame components and the Flutter widgets. The BLoC is provided by the use of a BLoC provider. At the state of our application after lesson 4 in this tutorial series, in the lib folder, we have the main.dart file. The main.dart file on line 31 here after lesson 4, it has a BLoC provider right there. The BLoC provider has a child. The child is a scaffold. The scaffold has a stack. The stack is the way that we place the Flame layer and the Flutter layer on the same screen. So it's in a stack. It's like layers, right? So the Flame layer is on the bottom and the Flutter layer is on the top. So this key line here, BLoC provider, which is this block, and the block is being provided to both the Flame and Flutter layers. In this example, thus far in the lesson, there's only a single block, and we've called it score block. If you have multiple blocks, you need to use a multi-block provider. We just have one block, which is the score block. We created this thing. When you're dealing with Flutter, the Flutter has a context, and so the communication can be attached to the context. I'm in lib, and I put the Flutter file in flutter layer.dart. This is just a stateless widget. And the stateless widget has a context here. And we're using this BLoC builder from Flutter BLoC. And BLoC builder, the syntax is you pass it the BLoC and the state. Once you have the state, you can access the BLoC variables right here. So we have the blocks here, and the structure of the block, there is a variable here which we're accessing. Because the Flame components do not have a context, we have to use a separate mechanism to actually pass the block down to the individual components. For example, a character or a treasure. The Flutter portion here is fairly straightforward. You can also use a different BLoC tutorial for the Flutter to understand what's happening. We're using it to control the menu and the score. So in the Flutter lib directory, you have your main.dart, which you're used to. This thing has the BLoC provider in it. And one of the directory structures right under lib, in our case, we created something called blocks, and in here we're storing the block. So we have a subfolder called treasure or score or coin, depending on what type of block you're trying to store, and there are 3 different files here. So let's look at our application. Lib, there's blocks, and we have score, state, event, and block. So there are the 3 files that we created for our game. there's generally multiple blocks, and our game will progress so that there's going to be a qubit so that we can show qubit to block communication and different ways you can handle the communication between the block or two different blocks or a block and a qubit. Because the flame layer does not have the context, we have to use a separate mechanism here. So there's the flame game. Let's trace the path down again. All right, so in lib, there's main.dart. We've already established the connection between the main.dart file and this flame layer. It's in a stack, and it's one of the layers of the stack. So then we go into the flame layer. Okay, I have two different files. The first question is, why are there two different files? Well, this file called flame layer is a Flutter widget, and the Flutter widget has the context. So we're grabbing the context so we can grab this score block here. And once we have the context for the block, we're passing it to the flame game, which is called Pinkie game. So let's check out Pinkie game. So Pinkie game extends the flame game. Okay, let's go back to flame layer.dart and why we have this separate Flutter widget in the flame portion. And to recap again, we're grabbing the context to set up this communication channel down, and we are reading the block from this context, and then we are passing the block to our flame game right here. Inside of the flame game, we now have the block. Because we have the block inside of the flame game, we can now access the attributes of the block. So at this point here, we've established how the block is getting into the flame game. When we're passing in the block from the context, so now our flame game has the context. There's an onload method in the flame game, and when the game loads, we're adding something called the flame block provider or the flame multi-block provider if there's multiple blocks. In our base game, we're starting off with a single block. So the new package, flame block, gives us this flame block provider. We're using flame block provider dot value. The value here is the score block, which we passed in and we got from the context of the layer, the Flutter widget. The block provider, flame block provider, also has a set of children, and the children are the pieces of treasure, so we're using gems. And also Pinkie. So we're using the flame block provider as a way to add the individual component from the flame game system. If we used a flame multi-block provider, which we will use in the future, there's going to be another property called providers. However, at this stage, it's more simplified, that there's only the single provider for a single block, and then we have the list of children. So this thing is a list, right? Because the block is connected to the flame component, and this one's the treasure, and there's a connection from game ref. So score block is the variable that we created for block. we can now do things like add an event to the stream. In this case, when the character Pinkie hits the piece of treasure, the score will be increased by 1 because we're adding this event to the stream. Key concept is that the game has a variable score block that we set up, and then we're adding it to the stream. The next lesson question is, how do we get the treasure, let's say, to update, or maybe you want to change the color or something. You want something else to happen to the treasure when the state changes, right? Maybe you have an actor and like a character, and the character picks up a sword or something. Well, we're going to have to use the flame BLoC provider here and then pass it down. So I'm going to jump to the BLoC to sprite communication here. So it's the same component in sprite with the treasure. It's one of the gems that we are using. And we're using the mix-in from Flame BLoC called Flame BLoC Listenable. What this Flame BLoC Listenable does is allows us to listen to changes in the state of the block. So once we have this Flame BLoC Listenable, we're going to get access to a new method. The method is from Flame BLoC, and it's called onNewState. When the state changes, it's going to receive the current state. So the state is like the score updates, the gem type changes in this case, something happens, and it's listening to changes of the state. When the change occurs, you have access to the state right there. And in this case, our state has we're gonna add a new variable called gem type here. And it will change the gem, the graphic for the gem based on the gem type. In addition to this connection point of the mix-in Flame BLoC Listenable, when we set up the BLoC provider, and the BLoC provider is here in the Flame layer in Pinkie game. When we're providing the block, we are specifying the block and the state, and that is getting passed down. So stay tuned for the next video when we'll just focus on the code and keep at it. It's can be a little overwhelming to work with BLoC, but it's very useful as you build more complex Flutter games or more complex Flutter apps. So have a great day.